Hello, I'm Dr. Ryan Alcantara with USC Rossier Career Services, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Career Pivots, lessons from Rossier alumni who have chartered new courses. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Susie Lopez-Guerra, who is the State Director of the National Center of Education and the Economy, and whose career journey began as a teacher and an active community member, and where she now works at the intersection of education and policy for a national organization seeking transformative changes in the education system. More about Susie in a moment, but first let me introduce Isabel Wright, the other half of the Rossier Career Services team, who will help in managing today's chat and the Q&A portion of our program. Isabel.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Isabel Wright. I'm the Career Services Specialist here at Rossier Career Services. Just a quick reminder, please turn on your cameras if you are in a space to do so, particularly when we move into the Q&A portion of the program. It would be great to be able to see all of you. Feel free to add questions to the chat or raise your hands.
Thank you, Isabel. Dr. Susie Lopez-Guerra is an esteemed educator and change maker with a wealth of experience in public school administration and educational research. As a first-generation and bicultural and bilingual female who was born and raised in Santa Ana, Dr. Lopez-Guerra has dedicated her life to making privileged knowledge common knowledge. She began her professional career as a teacher and working in Santa Ana Unified School District before moving to the role of Director of Community Relations. Throughout her career, she has served on a number of community boards and commissions, including but not limited to Arts and Cultural Commissioner for the City of Santa Ana, Board of Directors for California Health Initiatives of Orange County and the Santa Ana Chamber of Commerce. Her many accolades include City of Santa Ana's Community Builder Award, the League of United Latin American Citizens as the Hispanic Women of the Year, one of Orange County Hispanic Women of the Year, the Women of Distinction by Congressman Lou Carrera. As State Director of NCEE, she is part of an organization dedicated to building broad, shared prosperity in the United States, achieved by supporting education leaders and practitioners, policymakers, researchers, and community stakeholders to study, design, and build equitable, high-performing, and cost-effective education and workforce development systems, with the aim of ensuring students are prepared to contribute to our democratic society and compete in the global economy. Her educational journey began at UC Riverside, where she earned a BA in English literature and a minor in Spanish, go Highlanders. And after that, she obtained a Master of Science in Education and an administrative credential from Cal State Fullerton, as well as a multiple subject credential. And of course, she earned her EDD in Educational Leadership and Administration from USC Rossier. Fight on. Welcome, Susie. It is an absolute pleasure to have you join us on our Career Pivot series. As we get started, I invite you to share a little bit more about your journey, which does not follow the typical career trajectory, if there is such a thing, insights on making the decision to leave the public education system. And I would also love for you to share more about NCEE and the work it is doing to transform educational systems. Susie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Ryan. And thank you, everyone, for giving of your time, which to me is one of the most precious treasures, and being here and deciding to spend time and energy with us. As Ryan said, my name is Susie Lopez-Guerra, and I currently serve as the state director for a national nonprofit that, as he lightly stated, focuses on the intersectionality between policy, practice, and research. And I'll go into that a little bit. But I think one of the most important parts is the journey of how I got here. And I say journey as a process, not a destination. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But I was a pre-med major for a little bit, and that didn't work out. Then I was an English lit major. And I say this because as a first gen, my parents were quite confused to why I was getting a major in English if I already spoke it, and Eric saying yes. You know, they were trying to figure that out. And upon graduation, I was going to go to law school. And my fiance at the time was going to start his MBA at Marshall, SC. And there was this thing called No Child Left Behind. And I talk about this because we're going to be talking about policy and the implications it has on education. That was in a time where the federal government was infusing the Department of Education with funding to ensure that class size reductions, that they were implementing class size reductions. So there was an overwhelming need for new teachers. And I was welcomed into a classroom with little or no pedagogical or content knowledge experience. But I had a lot of mentors along the way. And so often when I talk about my journey, I say that it was a series of fortunate events. And although that turned out beautiful and continues to be the case for me, I really do believe that strategic thinking and planning with flexibility as we engage in this journey is of essence, right? So I was a bilingual education teacher. I did primary academy, which was those students who did not necessarily go into first grade as they should be prepared, but since at that time kinder was not a state mandated grade, the parents could opt to promote them on. And I did that for a few years. My husband and I have a 20-year-old child. I have a baby, and I wanted to not be in the same developmental stage as her with the students who I got to teach for a long time. So I decided to go into 5th grade. Ultimately, I moved on to the district level and wrote curriculum pre-kinder 12 with integrations of special education and biliterate education and different things. And then there was another opportunity. There was an opportunity for a new position at the district where I attended, matriculated, and spent the majority of my career in this new role called Director of Community Relations and Governmental Affairs. And I went to the people who had been my mentors, or I thought so, and I said, hey, I'm thinking of applying. May I please have a letter of recommendation? And the number of times that I had, that's fine, but there's a glass ceiling and you need to follow these steps. If not, this is not going to happen. And so I decided not to apply. And I had another mentor who's a superintendent up north, who's also a Rossier doctor alum. And she gave me a letter of recommendation and she said, apply. It's in an hour. And so when people have that level of faith and support for and of you, you move forward, because sometimes this concept of being in a place where you shouldn't be is all self-imposed, and we'll talk about that later. But I served in that role and did a myriad of things. I developed the practice of family and community engagement, a division that was reflective of the community that's a model nationally. And I grew the presence of the district at different tables, as Ryan talked about, sitting in at one point at 15 boards. And so that was my job, and acting as the de facto chief of staff for the superintendent. And that was beautiful. And I thought for the rest of my life that I was going to stay at that same district, because my family has been in this city since the late 1880s. And I'm a first gen, and we can have that conversation if you need questions on that. But I thought, I'm going to stay here until I become the superintendent. This is the journey I'm taking. And I had someone tap my shoulder from a nonprofit organization for 2 years, of people who we were doing work with who had come into the district. And I had revamped the program they were doing to be reflective of the context of the district that I was serving. And it worked out. And I decided to do that. And a lot of people were questioning, well, what happens to your pension? What happens to your longevity? What happens to the impact of students? And I have to tell you that as scary as it was exhilarating. And the opportunity to serve not only a city, but an entire state with a global perspective on the highest performing systems of the world and how we can truly prepare our students and meet them where they are, provide them the opportunities, was an opportunity and a challenge I could not step away. So I've been in this role for almost 2 years now. It was quite a steep learning curve because I'm a researcher by trade. I knew my craft. I led the professional learning. I developed the things. And in this new capacity, I was the learner. And that in itself was humbling because I was no longer at the front being the visionary. I was the one carrying out the vision. So that was a point of inflection and reflection for me that allowed me to say, I used to think I was going to end up here. But now when people say, well, what do you want to do next? Well, I don't know. I'm happy right now, but I don't know what the world offers me, right? And since then, there's been opportunities I had done by national opportunities with Mexico in the past. There's been opportunities with New Zealand that I have engaged in. So now it's this wider world, and so this concept of pivoting, I would like to reframe in a way of reflective practices, right? How are we open to opportunities, and how do we sit in the knowledge of what we bring to the table and the value added that we are, right? We constantly, as a first gen, think of this concept of imposter syndrome, right? What am I going to do in a nonprofit? What am I doing in higher academia? What am I doing here in spaces where we normally don't see ourselves reflected for whatever reason, right? Because how we identify and identify, how do we self-identify and then identify within a social cultural context is very independent and individualized. And I have learned that I'm not trying to be anyone else but Susie. And in that knowledge of almost turning 50 sits this high level of comfort of saying, I'm trying my best and I'm engaging in wonderful learning opportunities. And so now I see these pivots, reflection as learning opportunities and opportunities to grow, not so much only as a professional, but as the entirety of who I am and what I bring to the table. And I think that if someone were to say in 1999, which I know none of you were born, what would you tell your 1999 self, starting educator? I would say, you don't need to know everything. You're perfectly imperfect the way you are. And live in the moment, be your best, and continue seeking out opportunities because you never know what's out there and who's going to see the light that you bring. And that, I think, has been one of the things that has allowed me to continue making the impact that I feel is reflective not only of my values and my moral, but of the learnings that I've gathered professionally and personally. And I want to do a little segue back into SC. So I wasn't looking to go get my doctorate. And this goes back to that whole notion of a series of fortunate events, right? And I want to call this out very intentionally, especially for the females in this group. So one of my girlfriends comes up to me, and my daughter's 2 years old. And she says, oh my God, I found this fabulous program, blah, blah, blah. I look at it and I said, oh my God, it sounds great. She's like, let's do it. I said, okay, let's do it. So I come home, I tell my husband, and he's like, of course. All right, let's do this. But then I had to sit my mom down. My parents are very involved in co-raising our daughter. And I said, Mommy, Papi, I want to go back to school. And my parents, I'm going to engage translinguistically right now, said, otra vez, which means again. And I said, sí. So my mother, in essence, moved into the house. She would get here at 6 in the morning, leave at 10, take care of everything that leading a house requires, from cleaning, cooking, to helping raise my child, so that I could focus on doing the work that fed me. Because if I could be in academia my whole life, that's where I would live and thrive. And it was the most selfish but fulfilling opportunity I gave myself. And the other part that I want to highlight, and I don't know if Gabriela is speaking at the other webinar, Ryan, but it was the first time that I walked into a classroom, my first doctorate class, and saw someone who looked and sounded like me. And that was so powerful. And the last part I'll tell you about my experience with her, this is my favorite. So yes, I am a geek and a nerd. And so I got my first paper back, and it was not the grade that I wanted or needed or thought I deserved. So I emailed her like at 3 a.m. I said, Dr. Mathi, I need to sit with you and understand what this grade is. It was a C, it wasn't horrible, but I was like, I don't do this. She emailed me 30 minutes later, and she's been one of my biggest champions and biggest advocates since then. But it's been a journey. So again, you deserve to be in the seat you are. The only limits that are imposed are those that we set upon ourselves. And I would say part of the pivot came about because I was showing up as my most authentic self and engaging my network, right? It was not only that the organization who I now get to be part of saw the value, but they also the value in my research and my professional practice, but in the value of my values and my moral and who I am and what I bring to the table. So that would be the gist of this traditional and non-traditional, but very much the journey. And another part that I want to add is, as women, we sometimes question how far we're going or how fast we're going. And again, for the ladies in Arnold, I'm not pointing you out, and I'm not assigning gender or oh God, pronouns to anyone right now, unless you let me know on the chat. It's we have to be each other's biggest advocates, and we have to make space, not just at the table, but we have to make sure that we say each other's names and be open to being not only the ones saying the names, but the ones putting in the names and engaging that network. And please know that I'm part of your network, and I'm part of this desire to lift others forward. So I'm here to answer any questions. Ryan, back to you. I hope this has given you some more or less insight on my curvy journey that reflects learning, because learning is not linear. So there goes the psych researcher for you.
No, and I'll say I really don't like the phrase career path, because it kind of suggests there's this step and the next step, and then what's the next step, and that linear process works for some people, maybe a lot of people, but I think for those that it doesn't work, when we say career path, people are like, well, what's the next step I should be doing? Or like, oh, I don't think that I'm on the right path to do X, Y, and Z. So it is a series of fortunate, sometimes unfortunate events that lead us to where we're at. And it's kind of maximizing those opportunities. So I'll say, encourage folks, if you're in a space, to turn on your camera so we can see each other. And I want to invite our participants to ask questions. So you can do that via the chat or raise your hand and ask Susie directly. I've got some questions, so as we allow our participants to think about any questions they might have. It's an interesting process of kind of being pursued. Like, you've got a clear aim or a place that you see yourself staying in. So a little twist on the question I shared with you before. I think of it comes from a place of privilege. Sometimes people are strategic in that, of how do you put yourself out there so that you are the targeted person for a superintendent seat, or to go on to a nonprofit. Reflecting on things from that vantage point of where, if you were to do it again with the intent of opening up my options, how might you approach and leverage that network? And my sense is that was not the game plan as you were out there in the community. But if people want to be more strategic in that vein, what are some of the tips that you might have?
Well, you're right. It was definitely a point of privilege. I would say your work speaks for itself. And so it wasn't something that I sought, but the work that again, the alignment with my moral and ethical values was the foundation of that. And I want to put that as, it does not matter what you're doing. It does not matter if you're doing an internship. It doesn't matter if you're networking. The way you present yourself and the way your actions speak towards the person you are, not that you're not allowed to make mistakes, are key. So in retrospect, where I would be I would be ensuring that every opportunity that I have to highlight who I am, what I believe in, what I do, and what I have accomplished are highlighted by me through whatever platform I use, but also by those who I feel could say my name in the spaces where I would like to be. Because then it happens, and I'll give you an example to that. I had the privilege of speaking at a leadership summit this Saturday, and I was in the car with one of my girlfriends who so graciously joined me and said, "I'll be your secretary for the day." She's a VP of a major university, and I said, "Okay, you could be my person today." And she said something, she's like, "I think I've been out of Orange County too long now." She's like, "But you have not." And I said, "Well, what are you saying?" She's like, "People say your name in spaces even when you're not there." And that's not something that I've done strategically, but it's more of who I am and how I show up. So this concept of being your most authentic self is always, to me, the easiest part, if you will, to the students who are here, because it's not something that you have to work at. It's a habit of who you are. It's an extension of the way in which you engage with others. And I think that in itself is it's such an essential thing, because people can train and teach skills, but the disposition and that humanity, I think, is your greatest asset. Did that
Absolutely.
answer your question with clarity, Ryan? I know I went a little bit in a couple of places.
No, it did. I mean, it's the interesting part. And I love that. I mean, I love that notion of living your authentic self. And part of that, I mean, it's being true to yourself, um, and being in a space where you're able to leverage that. I mean, you have such strong connections to Santa Ana and an authentic commitment to students. And so when you bring all of that together, you know, you can be recognized as a superstar and acknowledged, and that can put you in strategic places even when you don't have that focus. And I think the beautiful thing is, you know, if you work with that passion, you can be recognized. And that's, I think, an important message for a lot of us to hear, that, you know, embrace the impact of our work, and you can be recognized for that work.
And in turn, I'm going to say, Ryan, because if you don't, lived in and experienced it, others would gladly take credit for your work.
Yeah, that's true. Well, and don't be shy about it necessarily. And I think that's oftentimes issues and challenges that folks have. And I'll point to first generation. And I think, you know, oftentimes too, with women in leadership positions of, you know, being more humble than we ought to be. And like you said, if you're humble or too humble, others will be happy to step in and take credit for that work. So it's that balance. I mean, I think one of the lessons learned is embrace and take charge of that narrative of the
Yes.
impact that you're making.
And I want to go back to two things in my introduction, and I'm very solid on this. And to our undergrad students, there was no way I was there. I mean, I mentioned my age earlier. This is something that I would say in the latter part of the last 15 years is something that I've solidified. And it doesn't mean it doesn't change, but I have an ethos of what guides my work, right? And Dr. Alcantara said it, it's making privileged knowledge common knowledge. And what I mean by that is the landscape that I work to create for myself and others, right? How do we understand what networking looks like? How do we understand what access to higher education looks like, so that we're not navigating in this nebulous land, whether it be professionally or personally, right? So all the things that I currently do, whether it's associations to nonprofit or affinity groups, professional groups, is with that lens, right? Does it fit with my ethos? And the other part that I had to define for myself, and we're going to talk about policies in a little bit, was when I did the work and things were challenging. I always call it my trifecta, right? Is it legal? Is it ethical and moral? And is it good for kids? And if I could honestly answer those questions, then I forge forward unapologetically.
That's great. That's right. And that's a good segue. What role have mentors and networking played in navigating your career? And you've
So
talked
I'm
a
going to
little bit
start.
about this, but
Yeah, I'm going to start with the networking. The first time I went to a networking event, I got there. I'm an introvert. I'm a high functioning introvert. I'm going to lay that out. And so I got into a space and I didn't know what to do. And I didn't feel comfortable just joining up a table and starting a conversation. It was so awkward and uncomfortable for me. I was also a lot younger and I had to deal with a little bit of the gender disparity issues that sometimes females who are perceived to be better looking have to deal with, right? Or some of the norms that have been acceptable. So that in itself was a difficult thing. But what I started doing was starting gravitating to people who I felt comfortable with. And then associating myself with them, almost like the coalition of the willing or like a building of a snowball, right? And then in that way, I started growing my comfort. And then they would bring me in and say, oh my God, Susie, have you met Ryan? Oh, hi, Ryan. Okay, nice to meet you. And so that's how I got out of my discomfort. And so now when I walk in a space, even if I don't meet anyone, it's that I look him in the face. My handshake is probably what some people perceive a little bit too strong, but it's my comfort. I make sure that I'm going to say curate how I'm going to present. So sometimes I mentally rehearse what entering a space is going to be, what I'm going to wear, which seems very superficial, but it takes a little bit of the anxiety off. If I feel completely comfortable in my skin, then I'm comfortable in engaging in conversations with others. I also never talk politics, and we can talk about that, but I also always talk values, and we can have that conversation another day. And then my mentors, I have a group in Orange County who I call lovingly my madrinas. And those are ladies who say my name, who pass my resume for things, who submit X and Y, and who will stand at the hilltops supporting one another because they had to be the trailblazers 30, 40 years ago for themselves. And so part of what I do is pay it forward. So it's that notion that a mentor doesn't have to be someone who you perceive is already in a professional place where you see yourself. It can also be someone who you see personally in a space where they're comfortable and you want to learn how to feel that way about yourself in different spaces.
great. Just a reminder, if folks have questions, feel free to jump in. But I want to take some time to talk a little bit more about the policy work that you're engaged in with NCEE. Why don't you share that with us?
Thank you, Ryan. Like you mentioned earlier, the organization, the National Center on Education and the Economy, works in the intersectionality between policy, practice, and research. And the reason that that is so important is because then that creates that solid foundation to change systems, right? If you have wonderful pedagogy, but you don't have the research to support that science, it's not sound. And if you don't have the policies, I'm going to call it the guardrails, that ensure that that foundation is going the right way, then you're not moving the work forward. And when we're talking about policy, policy is more or less, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it are the guiding rules for how a particular system functions. And so one of the things that I'm not personally engaged in, but my colleague is, our organization has 5 state level partnerships with policy, but one of the ones that I'm super excited about is in Las Vegas, where they've developed the Commission on Education, have adopted an assembly bill, and are continuously looking at their educational system as a state, and then the particular county offices of ed, and then ultimately the districts are taking the context of their particular school districts to interpret that. But there is a clear understanding of what the expectation is for anyone who enters their educational system. And it's so powerful because with that systemic change, you can ensure that it is weatherproof, if you will, and that it also is sound and it's not at the whim of, now we're going to throw X amount of money this way without it being aligned, intentional, and purposeful into impacting students. So they're in the process of finalizing a learner profile, right? What are those characteristics? What are we looking, what is it that we as a state commit to ensuring that our students are able to do? And it's more about the character and the characteristics of a human, and then the pedagogy and the instructional components then go through that.
Wonderful. I'll just say the ability to really work policy with a cross section of people is so important, because exploring the complexity of educational policy and navigating the operations. I've studied policy for a long time, and implementation can be a huge barrier. But if people are involved in the process, they're bought in. It certainly is a reminder that things still happen the way they ought to happen, where there's lots of engagement. So I appreciate that. Any questions from the group?
I had a question. Sorry, y'all, I have my camera off because I'm driving home. But Susie, thank you for everything you've been sharing. My name is Dr. Natalie Mejia, and I'm a high school principal here in Boyle Heights. I'm curious just to learn more about, I don't know, I'm just curious to know more about like how can we best prepare with the new rollouts coming out with the current administration on like what's the best way to kind of really advocate for our students, and like how can we leverage the alumni network through USC, given that we are a school that stands on equity and social justice. So I'm just kind of curious, like bigger picture, if in your organization have you already discussed that, and or even Dr. Ryan, if there's anything already too in the works that like alumni can come together to better advocate for some of the educational changes that are going to be happening through policy reform under the new administration.
So for NCEE, Natalie, and I'm hoping that you'll get my contact information, and do not hesitate to reach out, please. But for NCEE, we're a bipartisan organization, and the reason we do that is because we work in all 50 states, and we work in international settings. So what we're trying to do, and we're committed to do, is focus on doing the work. And regardless of what labels are there, we're not focusing on label. We're focusing on the research and the practices that we all know sometimes get used differently. Does that make sense, Natalie? and we're doing that. However, I'm gonna switch a little bit on you, Ryan. I'm also part of the California Association for Latino Superintendents, and through there we have conversations and tools. And if you reach out, our legal affiliates have they have a website and tools that break down a lot of that and provide insight and support to other districts who need to have those conversations. So that's the route that we're taking as a national organization. Again, we're bipartisan because we work in different states that have had very different ideologies and practices that are, not new to what California is now experiencing. But there are many, many resources. And again, my contact information will be there for you. My cell phone, if you reach out by email through either Ryan or myself, I'll give you my cell phone. I'm happy to engage in conversations on what different districts have shared with us about what their practices are and how they're moving forward.
Thank you. I'll
Ryan?
definitely be in touch.
Of course, Natalie. Ryan, do you want to say anything on SE?
Sure. And I just put your email in the chat so folks can have access to that. Thank you for offering that up. So certainly Dean Noguera is very much committed to equity. We have these conversations and groups of alumni that are engaged in the conversations too. So I think one of the big strategies are taking advantage of those opportunities, and our DSAG. So we have the Dean's Superintendent Advisory Group that meets several times a year. And I know this is an issue that they'll be discussing. And part of it is that discussion of strategy and approaching. And, we want to maintain, how do we continue to move forward in supporting our students and student success? And that should be a bipartisan topic. So, what are the strategies what are the approaches that are kind of taking place at different institutions, and that sharing of information and resources. On the higher ed side, we're in the midst of developing that network amongst leaders of higher education. And again, I know this will be a conversation at that point. And at those gatherings, and then the big challenge is then how do we, maintain those conversations and extend it to other members of our community. And that is a focus. I mean, that's one of the value added of our network. So I would just say stay tuned and continue to make sure that you're on the listserv distribution for alumni or for student events, and be part of those conversations. And if you miss them, reach out to coordinators of that. Oftentimes we'll record those sessions. And the next step is following up with people. I mean, the great thing about our network is when we have panelists, they're oftentimes alumni, and like Susie, are willing to talk to you directly. I think too often we go to these presentations and we're like, oh, that was great. And you don't take that next step of saying, sign me up, or I've got some follow-up questions, and having those conversations with folks, because that's how we learn, right? And particularly in times of large-scale change, and what's happening at the federal level is directing different kinds of changes that we'll see. It's how do we approach that, and sharing those resources and strategies.
And if I may, Natalie, the work of serving a community, and I'm going to go back to, is I think, to me, apolitical, right? So even in my previous iterations of professional journeys, I've constantly worked with the elected officials from every side of the aisle, as well as, for Santa Ana's context, I can't even think, the Mexican consulate. So it's understanding and meeting people where they are with that reflective component versus that reactionary. So that's what I would say. Start learning what things are there. And again, I'll be happy to connect with you and follow up.
Awesome. Thank you both for what you shared. And I've added my LinkedIn in just because I want to stay connected. I feel like I graduated in 2020. So I don't know, somehow I just started getting these emails now, or maybe they were in another inbox before. I'm not sure. But now that I see all the opportunities, to your point, Ryan, I'm like, sign me up, because I'm like, there's a lot going on right nationally, but we also have a network of folks who have experience that I can glean on as a high school principal. So I could share those resources with my students and with our families. Because I do serve in Boyle Heights, where there's a large Latino population, but also a largely undocumented population. So I just want to make sure I'm made abreast of all the different things that I can offer. So thank you both.
Thank you. And I've already actually clicked on it and connected with you.
I have
Not
as well.
like the
Thank you,
present.
Natalie. Appreciate that. Other questions? We do that. I'll say, Susie, what are some of the professional development tools and resources that you've taken advantage of in your journey and you recommend for other folks?
I actually did through NCEE, I did the National Institute for School Leadership, which is an 18-month program that my district at the time offered and many of the districts pay for. And I would feel that aside from the doctoral journey that I had with SC was one of the most valuable professional learning opportunities because it grounded everything in research, but it provided me systemic application, fully focusing on transforming systems. And so that in itself was very powerful. I constantly am reading. I'm reading research. I'm applying research. I belong to professional organizations, as I stated in the past, and I'm on LinkedIn a lot, and I'm not getting paid for LinkedIn, but I'm constantly trying to figure out what resources are there, learning from best practices of others, and really trying to connect and learn from one another. And I think those, I would say, if you were to say what are 3 or 4 of the things that you do, it's that. And then attending SC webinars with some of my colleagues when they tap my shoulder and say, I'm doing this, let's do this. But it's engaging in conversations at every opportunity. What else can we be doing? And so that, whether it's a LinkedIn thing, one thing that I'm going to say, and Natalie, you're obviously on LinkedIn, but if any of you are undergrads, just curate your work and really be intentional about how you're presenting yourself as your most authentic self, but with the cognition of what the audience is, right? LinkedIn is a professional platform. My worlds never clash, right? My personal social media doesn't bleed into my professional, because there's ways in which I curate who, not that it's not authentic, but it's the audience that I'm engaging with in different platforms.
Yeah. And I'll say, I know kind of my observation is teachers don't tend to be on LinkedIn, but when you move into administrative roles, it becomes something that's important to do, and that continued growth. So for those folks that are in that phase of I'm not using LinkedIn, but you want to think down the road, and kind of begin that process of that, or as you start your doctoral program, that's one of the things that you'll want to do is, how do I define my professional self?
Think of it as your digital CV, if you will. And for teachers, it's a shame that not more of them use it, because they're engaging in such innovative and amazing learning journeys with students that it would be a learning opportunity for them, but for others to learn from them.
How has your Rossier education prepared you for your leadership roles?
It afforded me a level of networking as I was emerging into cabinet level positions at the district, and then now with the greater expanse in California, there's a lot of us, right? So I would say the network itself, there's how can I say this without confusing anyone? We see each other and we know the quality of work that we put in to be where we are. So there's that recognition and respect. I think that's the word I was looking. There's that I see you, right? It also allowed me to feel seen and heard, and I mentioned it earlier. I engaged with people who I had read about, right? Like Sandy Kaplan. I used to be a gate teacher, and when I got to sit in classes with her and learn, I engaged in deep research on pedagogy, primarily for students who were in alternative education settings. And I'm not talking about alternative schools, but just in ELOP, before ELOP was a conversation. Ryan, you know this, I helped through my dissertation rewrite the Readers Plus program. So it allowed me to delve deeply into what I loved, which was this concept of access in reading and in family engagement without really knowing. But it gave me the research and it gave me the practices. So not only did it allow me to delve deeply into that, but it opened up a world of educational psychology, right? Of a love and passion that now is part of my research and my ethos, right? So it gave me that practical networking opportunity, but it also grounded in deep knowledge so that as I step forward, I'm solid in how I'm showing up, right?
That's great. That's great. And I'll say that, that networking piece is something you have to work at. You have to really make sure you're taking advantage. That's, of your full USC experience by connecting with your fellow students, maintaining those relationships, reaching out to folks. And that's another great way to utilize LinkedIn, is to search for your fellow Trojans that are doing the work that you want to do, or at places that you want to work, because Trojans really do help other Trojans. But that doesn't happen by sitting on the sidelines and wondering and hoping that folks reach out to you. You have to be very proactive about that.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate, because you've talked a lot about strategizing around networking, and it's important to know. We've got time for a couple more questions, so I want to make sure if we've got folks on the call that are interested. I also want to point out Dr. Mejia is with us, and he'll be joining us next week for our final installment this semester on career pivots. Thank you so much, Eric, for joining us. I'm looking forward to our chat next week.
Of course, thank you for the invitation. It's great hearing from you, Dr. Susie. I mean, it's the messaging. I mean, what you said has hit home in a lot of ways, and you saw me nodding my head because it was just so. It's so reminiscent of what I went through. But this is your time. Next week, we'll definitely talk a little bit more about my journey for sure. But thank you for having me.
No, Eric, thank you. And I look forward to connecting. I'm so thankful for Ryan's invitation and opportunity to share time and space with you all, genuinely.
Great. Any other questions from our participants? I'll say, Susie, I want to give you an opportunity, as we come close to wrapping up, if there are any, in terms of, navigating those changes, those decision points in your career journey, what are things that you want students and alums that have listened to this to really hone in on and reflect on as they're preparing? Because a lot of our students, particularly in our doctoral programs, that becomes a point where I'm ready for a change, and so just things to be mindful of as those inflection points in their career take place. What are some of your recommendations on things to consider?
I have mentors. I have mentors who are what I think I want to be. I have mentors, and that is professionally and personally. I have mentors who are a lot older than me. I have mentors who are younger than me. And I'm constantly engaging in cognitive offloading with them. I'm thinking about this. What do you know? What do you think? How do I do it? How did you do it? What would you do? Am I crazy? Am I tripping over myself? It's going back, Ryan, to that letter that I told you that my mentor was like, no, you're applying. Here you go. You said you were. This is written for you. You're doing it. And so when someone, understanding that when you consider someone a mentor, it's that level of respect. And when they're willing to walk with you, sometimes you're going to fail forward, and that's okay, because that's also part of learning. And if we don't get outside of our comfort, as we've told those people who we are blessed to engage with, whether it be students, teachers, principals, if we don't practice that, and that goes back to that authenticity, then there's a level of inauthenticity right there, right? So I have a village. I have a village of family members. I have a village, I call them my madrinas, as I told you about. I have my hermanas. Like there's like these different levels of people who I do this with, right? And who are walking alongside me because they genuinely care about the totality of who Susie is. So know your people. It doesn't have to be your best friend. Sometimes it's someone you only call once in a while. And it's okay to say, would you like to be my mentor? That is part of that networking. If you see someone, if Isabel is doing something that I want to learn more about, would you mind being my mentor? And that could mean, that just means I don't want to be the colleague who doesn't know. It's mentor is opening that door and calling and asking some questions, right? It doesn't mean you're best friends. It means it's someone who you can be a thought partner with.
Yeah. And that's a really good point. It doesn't have to be somebody, you know, a generation above you, and it is a community. And for those, you know, listening to this that don't feel their networking, their support system is where it ought to be, you know, that the responsibility is on you to help craft that, and reaching out to folks, to alumni, to folks participating in programs like this, or to Isabel and I, and have strategy conversations, and really your faculty. Faculty is the first great place to start with that, because so many of our faculty at Rossier are practitioners or were practitioners, and so they understand, you know, not just things at an academic level, but an experiential level as well.
And I still reach out. Like I reach out to Eugenia or Kim or Xiomara. Like there's people, there's in keep tight hold on your network. Definitely.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Susie, for spending some time with us and sharing your insights. I really, truly appreciate it. It's been a pleasure talking with you this afternoon. So my closing words of advice is, you know, I'll have a couple of things of don't forget that career prep, spending that time on whether it's developing your application materials or building your network. You know, you've got to be both reflective and planning in that. So for our students, you know, you're have a lot of balls in the air, but one of those has to be thinking about that next step, if that's going to be important to you. Don't just wait till graduation and then, okay, I'm ready to be thinking about this, because particularly when we are dealing with a career pivot, networking is going to be a key piece to that, and it just is going to take time to build that. But even once you're in your profession, making sure that there's regular space that you're setting aside to be thinking about it, and it's not just transactional. It's not just, you know, what can I get out of these relationships? You know, what I'll say is I'll use your word, Susie, is authentic. These are authentic relationships. You want to make an impact with your students. You want to talk to people that have done that, and you're willing to talk to others, right? So it's not purely self-serving. It's not even mostly self-serving. It's how can I make a difference in the community that I'm working at. And certainly within the Trojan community, it's hard to say, I don't have time for that. And so folks are willing to help. Just put yourself out there. And so that would be my recommendation for you all as you kind of are thinking about careers and other things. So as we wrap up, I'll push it back over to Isabel, and she'll remind us of some of the upcoming events that we have.
Great. Thank you so much, Ryan. And thank you, Susie. I just dropped in the chat our spring calendar of events. Our next career pivots will be with Eric, who's here. Also nice to meet you. He's the VP of Admissions and Enrollment at Verbum Day, Jesuit High School. That'll be on March 10th from 4 to 5 via Zoom. And then we have a Networking with the Pros event on April 4th in person from 4 to 6 in the Vineyard Room. So be sure to check that out and RSVP on Handshake. Thank you so much, everyone.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you again, Susie, for spending some time with us today. Fight on, everybody, and feel free to reach out and connect if you've got any questions. We're here to assist you.